Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhuta Guhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarvavide Namaha. Very good. Welcome back, and welcome to our many students watching these classes online. We continue our study of this great text of Sri Shankara, Upadesha Sahasri. In chapter 18 we continue. And before we continue, there's a nice question that came with regard to the last class. Begins, when we talk about consciousness as the witness of mental vrittis, consciousness as the witness. Instead of conscious, in fact, I'm going to be really fussy now because these words get misunderstood. Consciousness doesn't do anything. Consciousness doesn't witness. We use the word sakshi for consciousness in the status. That is consciousness, I should say, consciousness having in relationship to the mind, consciousness can be said to be sakshi. But consciousness as such, we don't say witnesses the mind. Consciousness as such doesn't do anything. Witnessing is a mental activity, right? So, just to be very precise in our terms. So when we talk about consciousness as the witness of mental vrittis, we'll rephrase it. When we talk about sakshi, the witness of mental vrittis, we seem to say that there are two things: witness consciousness, sakshi, and the witnessed vrittis. Correct. You had said in one of the earlier lectures that all vrittis are made up of consciousness alone. Correct. Sakshi, there is only consciousness. What is your experience made of? Is there anything in your experience right now in addition to consciousness? Anything material? Obviously not. Anything non-material, anything subtle? Consciousness is alone is the content of your experience. And again, I'm being very fussy about nomenclature right here because a lot of confusion comes specifically from our failure to understand these terms properly. So we could say that the content of experience is consciousness and consciousness alone. So that's correct. So what he said is that I said it in earlier lectures, we discussed that all vrittis are made of consciousness alone. Correct. So are we then saying, in the Advaitic sense, non-dual sense, that consciousness is only witnessing itself? There are several problems with that expression. Consciousness witnessing itself. First problem, as we said before, consciousness doesn't do anything. So consciousness doesn't witness anything. Second, consciousness witnessing itself is a logical impossibility, right? You can't see yourself with your eyes in the absence of a mirror. So consciousness can't witness itself. The very term witness suggests a duality between witnesser and witnessed. As soon as we have that duality, then there's no possibility of the witness witnessing itself. There must be this duality. So how can we clear up some of the conclusion here? I said already that consciousness doesn't do anything. What is Sakshi then? Sakshi literally is consciousness in the presence of the mind, and the essence of the one who observes the mind. I paused here because we're going to add something new right now. Everything here is vrittis. So that right now there is an object vritti, me, sitting in this chair as you watch me. And there's also a subject vritti. Remember ahankara we've discussed before? That sense of individuality. So that sense of individuality within you, when you say, I observe Swami Taratmananda, that I is a thought, right? When you say, I am observing Swami Taratmananda, that I is a thought. That thought is present in consciousness. Got it? In fact, that thought is nothing but consciousness, according to our discussion. I want to wrap this up quickly and come to our text. So the conclusion here then is there are two kinds of vrittis. There's the object vritti, that which is witnessed, and there's a subject vritti called ahankara. Object vritti is consciousness plus name and form. In this case, consciousness plus Swami Taratmananda's name and form. In the same way, the subject vritti is consciousness plus name and form. So, there's only consciousness because name and form is not a second thing in addition to consciousness, just like pot is not a second thing in addition to clay. There's only clay, there's only consciousness. Now, this, I'm being very technical, there's a lot of confusion about this, and the confusion arises because we forget that the purpose of these teachings is not to establish a metaphysical reality of Sakshi. This is a common confusion. We turn these teachings into philosophy. And Vedanta defines a Sakshi as such and such and such. And then we get very, in fact, even I'm becoming very particular about definitions. That's absolutely a fact. But let us not forget the purpose of all these teachings is not to define. We need definitions to understand. And as I said, if our definitions are fuzzy, our understanding will be fuzzy, obviously. So we're making this effort to define everything very carefully. But the purpose of Vedanta is not to define all these phenomena. What is consciousness? What is vritti? What is ahankara? What is sakshi? That's philosophy. What is the purpose of Vedanta? You've heard me say too many times, to solve the problem of suffering. Suffering is present in our experience. This analysis is to help us understand our experience. Let me summarize that then. The purpose of all these details is not to define what is Sakshi, what is consciousness, what is this, what is that. The purpose is to help you understand what you're experiencing right now and eventually discover the underlying reality, your reality, and thereby coming out of suffering. So let's not, and it's tricky, I admit it. So here in my reply to his question, I got very philosophical, very precise with terms. And I think we need that precision and we need these terms. That's unavoidable. But it would be a mistake to make those to make the terminology and distinguishing all these things properly, it would be a mistake to make that the goal. That's my point. The goal is not to define everything. The goal is to understand our experience, and we have this analysis to understand our experience. Okay, let us return to our text. In the prior series of verses, we were going through a process which could be called de-superimposition. My guru liked to use that awkward term. Superimposition means when you superimpose attributes of your body on consciousness, when you superimpose attributes of your mind on consciousness. We've discussed this at length, how that superimposition takes place, what are the consequences of that superimposition, and then how that superimposition can be removed. And the prior section was removing superimposition mostly through the use of yukti, reasoning. So we've used a lot of logic, a lot of reasoning. The basic reasoning here is anything observed by you is not you. Therefore, the attributes of anything observed by you don't belong to you. For example, this cloth is observed by you. Therefore, it's not you. Not only that, but the orangeness of this cloth doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the cloth. This is the analysis. So the body is known to you. Just like this cloth is orange, this cloth has the color orange. This body has many problems. Or better yet, mind. Just as this cloth has the color orange, this mind has, let's say, sadness. Just as the cloth has a color orange, mind has sadness. Orangeness belongs to the cloth. Sadness belongs to the mind. Cloth is something known to you, therefore different from you. Mind is something known to you, therefore different from you. This is the yukti, the logic we've been using in the prior sequence of verses. I'm making this point because with the next verse we have a shift of direction. Excuse me. Instead of using yukti going forward, we're going to Shankaracharya shifts gears, so to speak, and now instead of yukti, the basis is shruti, scripture. Remember shruti, yukti, anubhava. Anubhava is woven throughout this whole discussion and in my introduction. But here now, the focus is on scripture. Shruti, a good, if you like English words, scriptural revelation is shruti. So let's see the next series of verses, beginning with 11. Achakshushtvari shastroktam achakshushtvari chakstotram sabhahyabhyantaram hyajam sabhahyabhyantaram hyajam nityamuktam nityamuktam mumukshuschet sada smaret mumukshuschet sada smaret. Achakshushtva, title of our chapter, right? Which was based on a quotation from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Remember that we started the chapter, I quoted a negation, 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 negation. A chakshushka, not having no eyes, a shrotram, having no ears, etc., etc. And this, such statements, adi here means etc., and shastra uktam. Such statements are uktam, said, told, Shastra, in our scriptures. So here's our reference to Shruti, scriptural revelation, and in particular to the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. And he gives other references from the scripture, Sa Bahya Bhyantaram, that which is without, outside or inside, that which is, or that which is inside and outside, that which is he ajam, indeed unborn. No need to analyze all of this because you see the point is coming. That, and finally in the end of the third line, atmanam, uktam, you have to connect. So the scriptures describe atmanam, describe atma. Iha, here in all these scriptures, describes it in this way as being nitya muktam, eternally free. We've actually discussed each of these terms before, so we won't go into it further. But the key here is all of these are scriptural references. And then Shankara in the last line concludes, mumukshuhu chet, if you happen to be a mumukshu. Mumukshu is one who desires moksha, a seeker of moksha. By the way, a question that comes up so often is a mukshu has a desire, right? Aren't we supposed to give up all desires? Yeah, that's what the mumukshu wants to do. The mumukshu has a desire to overcome all desires. What's the problem? This is another example of trying to be like overly analytic. What do they say when they say you're too much in your head? And then this is an example. Doesn't the mumukshu have a desire? Yes. And they want to see that as being a crucial defect in the teachings of Vedanta. Of course the mumukshu has a desire. Everyone who's not yet enlightened has a desire. Fortunately, the mumukshu has a helpful desire. Why would we call it a helpful desire? When you fulfill other desires, say you have a desire for ice cream. Yesterday, somehow I was talking a lot about that. If you have a desire for ice cream, after eating ice cream, do all your desires go away? Certainly not. A mumukshu has a desire for moksha. After realizing that desire, does all his or her desires go away? So it's a very different kind of desire. It's a desire fulfilling which all other desires disappear. So it's good. Mumukshus should have a desire. In fact, they should have a strong desire. In one text, I think Shankara describes it as the mumukshu should have a desire for moksha like one whose hair has caught on fire has a desire for water. How's that? Which means intense desire. Anyway, let's come back to the verse. Mumukshuschet, if you happen to be this mumukshu with the hair on fire, then what? Sada smaret. You should, and I'll give you the literal translation first, which is a problem. Then, if you are mumukshu, you should always remember these scriptures. That's the literal translation. You should always remember these scriptures. So already you're seeing some of the defects in that literal translation. Better, you should always reflect on the scriptures. But even in translating it as you should always reflect on the scriptures, there are several problems come in this regard. What is our relationship with the Shruti? Since we're talking now not about Yukti, we're talking about Shruti, we're talking about scriptural revelation. What exactly is the role of Shruti for a mumukshu? Notice I said for a mumukshu because for a person who wants dharma, artha, and kama, the role of scripture is very different. So the scriptures tell you the rituals to be performed for the sake of dharma, artha, and kama. We had this discussion, I think, in one of the very first chapters of this text. We won't go back to all of that. So there, your relationship is a very pragmatic one. So the scriptures become like a cookbook to tell you what rituals are to be performed for the sake of getting that punya karma, born of those rituals, so that you can fulfill your desires here and perhaps in a future life. That clearly is not our relationship, mumukshuhu. So for mumukshu, the relationship to the scripture is very different. We don't want a cookbook to tell us what kinds of rituals to do. What do we want? We want freedom from suffering. Now here comes some other problems. Suppose someone thinks, well, scriptural revelations are to be believed. That's the orientation in all other scriptural traditions, Western religions, other religions, even for those who seek dharma, artha, and kama, even those, we call them karma kandis, because they follow the karma kanda, the ritualistic portion of the Vedas. They also have the same orientation, and the orientation is whatever the scriptures say have to be believed, unquestioningly believed, accepted, swallowed, my guru would sometimes say, to swallow these teachings, which means to just blindly accept those teachings. That's certainly the hallmark of Western religion, blind acceptance of these scriptures. So when the point here, when the scripture says, you are eyeless, achakshutva, you are eyeless, is that something to believe? Yeah, I believe. It's like the pastor cries out, Jesus has saved you. And everyone says, yeah, we believe. Sorry, I don't want to make fun of another tradition, but to distinguish the difference between belief and what we are seeking is not belief. I don't need to explain that to you. You understand very well that our goal is to discover your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, that so-called inner divinity, and with that discovery, you then become free from suffering. That's the goal, not to inculcate a belief. So the role of Scripture for us as mumukshus is not that we should believe, achakshushva, that I am without eyes, I am eyeless. Another common mistake, when he says smaret, remember, recall, to reflect, that leads to another kind of confusion, that you have to constantly remind yourself, I am eyeless, I am Satchidananda Atma, I am Brahman, I am Asangoham, I am unattached, I am Sarvavyapi, I am all-pervasive. And you have to go on remembering this all day long. Because, I'll be facetious now, if you happen to forget, even for a moment, you lose your enlightenment. How's that? You can see the massive confusion that can creep into this. The goal is not to maintain in your mind these teachings of Vedanta. The goal is not to maintain in your mind the thought, I am Brahman, I am Brahman, I am Brahman. It's not necessary. Why is it not necessary? When you wake up in the morning, do you have to remind yourself that you're a human being? Do you need to go check in the mirror? Thank goodness I'm not a cockroach. That's absurd. You don't need, you know you are a human being. Therefore, you don't have to remind yourself. When you know you are Brahman, you don't have to remind yourself. It's not a matter of memory. It's not a matter of constant reflection. There is a role for reflection called nididhyasana, but that's not our topic right now. The goal then is not, in fact, some books in English use this expression, self-remembrance. I forget, it may have been Yogananda, but I might be wrong about that. It's been decades and decades since I've read all that stuff. But it's an expression used in English by some Indian spiritual teachers. They use that expression, self-remembrance. Do you see? You can see, of course, the intent is good in using that kind of expression, but you can see how such expressions can get you in trouble. I constantly have to remember I am Satchidananda Atma. You get the point. So our goal here is knowledge. Now, this discussion is about what is the role of Scripture for a mumukshu. We're not going to believe it. We're not going to constantly remember it, constantly. Some people would constantly recite things. That's not it. What is the purpose of Scripture? Well, the metaphor we've used many times is our Scriptures are similar in some ways to a road map. The ancient rishis discovered something unique and wonderful, and in the Scriptures they composed, they provide us with what is equivalent to a roadmap. The purpose of a roadmap is to guide you to a destination. The purpose of the Scriptures is to guide you on a process of Atma Vichara, self-inquiry. Several times I've said that the main practice of Advaita Vedanta is Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. That's correct, but it would be even more correct to say that the main spiritual practice of Vedanta is Atma Vichara. Of course, that Atma Vichara takes place through Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. Self-inquiry. Since the problem is self-non-recognition, the solution to that problem will be found through a process of self-inquiry, Atma Vichara. But of course, that process of inquiry needs to be guided, and that's the role of Scripture. The role of Scripture then is to guide this process of self-inquiry, of Atma Vichara. Vasanti keeps telling me I should stop using this roadmap metaphor. Why? She says, no one uses roadmaps anymore. And that's true. I stopped driving a car many years ago. When I did have to drive, there was no GPS. So I would actually use road maps in those days. So I'm a little bit out of fashion, as they say, old-fashioned, but you all know what a road map is. But if you want to substitute it with GPS, that works just fine. In fact, a GPS shows you a map, does it not? Further, the GPS talks to you, which I find very annoying, but anyway, helpful. Okay, let's continue. Use of Scripture, Shruti, in the process of Atma Vichara. That's our topic. Good. Achakshushtwadi shastracha, achakshushtwadi shastracha, nendriyani sada mama, nendriyani sada mama, aprano hyamana shubhra, aprano hyamana shubhra, iti chatarvane vachaha, iti chatarvane vachaha. So, achakshustvadi, as the opening prior verse began, achakshustvadi shastrat cha. cha, and further from these scriptures, like you are eyeless, that reference to the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad passage we've seen many times. How are we to use these passages for the sake of Atma Vichara? The Upanishad says you have no eyes. And then based on that scriptural statement, you're intended to do Atma Vichara. By the way, Atma Vichara is often guided not merely by the scriptures, but by the scriptures and the Guru. What we're doing right now is Atma Vichara, self-inquiry, guided by the scriptures and guided by the Guru. That's what we're doing right now. So based on the scripture then, I have no eyes, then the inquiry is, how is it true that I have no eyes? Or you can put it in the question in the phrase, is it true that I have no eyes? And of course, we've already used the logic, that was the prior section, yukti. Eyes are known to you. Eyeballs are known to you. The power of sight is known to you. So anything known to you is not you. That's using yukti. Now using scripture. Scripture says, I have no eyes. And then you realize, well, scripture is the pointer, right? Like the roadmap. And I didn't mention, my common observation is memorizing the roadmap doesn't get you anything. That is, you don't want to learn about the roadmap, which is similar to another metaphor that's used, where scriptures are the pointer. And the problem here is if you look at my hand, you're missing the point, literally. Missing the point. So you have to look, what am I pointing at? So here, don't make that mistake with the scripture. The scripture is the pointer. What is it pointing to? It's pointing to an inner reality. It's pointing to your own consciousness. So scripture says, you have no eyes, pointing to your consciousness, and then you have to inquire, does my consciousness see? And we've analyzed that thoroughly. You understand that sight is a process that takes place with your eyes, with your brain, with your mind. The result of that process is an image that arises in your mind. That image becomes known to consciousness, revealed by consciousness, witnessed by consciousness. But notice that consciousness was not an agent in that process. Oh, that's interesting. Can your eyes see without consciousness? That's an interesting question. Can your eyes see without consciousness? Depends on what you mean by see. But if your eyes were, if there were an eyeball in a in a beaker of salt water, and if its cells had not yet died, then light could indeed strike the front of the lens and produce electrical nerve currents coming out the optic nerve at the back of the eyeball. Of course, an eye can function in the absence of consciousness, just like the streaming camera connected to your computer. The camera connected to your computer, does it work without consciousness? No problem, right? It won't work without electricity, but it doesn't depend on consciousness. The point I'm making is that sight is a worldly function, a worldly activity. It takes place mechanically, and that mechanical process is revealed by consciousness, the consciousness which is your essential nature. I'm just giving you an example of the Atma Vichara, the self-inquiry that is to be performed according to the scripture. So, scripture says, you have no eyes. We've just gone through an example of how we use the scriptural roadmap or the scriptural pointer. We use it for the sake of self-inquiry. Then the next example he gives, apranaha hi amanaha shubhra. Shubhra means shining. That which is shining, amanaha, without having a mind, apranaha, without having the life force. This is actually a reference to the Mundaka Upanishad. Earlier was from the Brihadaranyaka. So in the Mundaka, in fact, in the last line it says, iti, thus, iti cha, you have to separate out the cha, atharvane. In the Atharva Veda, the Mundaka Upanishad happens to be part of the Atharva Veda. So, Vachaha, the statement, Atharvane, in the Atharva Veda, the statement which comes from the Mundaka Upanishad, the statement that says, apranaha hi amanaha shubhraha. That statement is meant to be used for Atma Vichara. In the same way, apranaha does, allow me to use first person, does my consciousness breathe? Scripture says it doesn't. Is that true for me? Right now in my experience, is my consciousness breathing or is my body breathing? Amanaha. Right now I'm thinking. Who thinks? You know, we've gone through all of this. I won't drag you through it all again. Who thinks? And who is aware of the thinking? Shubhraha, shining, that shining consciousness. So the point here then is that each of these scriptural statements are meant to guide your process of Atma Vichara. So showing how we use not only yukti, reasoning, to guide this process of self-inquiry, we also use Shruti. Then, this topic concludes with the next verse. Shabdadi nama bhavascha, Shabdadi nama bhavascha, Shruyate mama katake, Shruyate mama katake, Aprano hyamana yasmad, Aprano hyamana yasmad, avikari sadahyaham, adika sadahyaham. Shruyate, the second line, it is heard, katake, in the Katha Upanishad. What is heard in the Katha Upanishad? Mama, for me. There is the abhava in the first line. There is the absence of shabdadin. Shabda means sound, and this is an adi, etc. This is a reference, actually it could be a reference to elements. Shabda is said to represent the element of space. And just as air is, anyway, let's not go through that level of detail here. So when it says, the scripture says, for me, there is the absence of shabda, etc. Could either, maybe we'll take it in a simpler way. Sense objects. Sound is something you hear. Taste comes to your tongue. Smells come to your nose, etc. And sounds, of course, to your ears. That sound belongs to consciousness or belongs to your ear. And belong is a wrong word, connected. Sounds are connected to your ear or connected to consciousness. Sounds are associated with your ear, with your power of hearing. This is the usage of the scripture. This is the last one example we'll see. How to use the scriptural revelation to guide the process of self-inquiry is to understand that sound. Another analysis goes like this. Sound it belongs to the world. Consciousness is a transcendent reality, not part of the world. There's no connection between the world and that which transcends the world. Any of these modes of inquiry based on this scriptural statement is what we're after. Although what I just given you is actually yukti. Maybe it's not such a good example, what I just gave you. So in a more direct sense, sounds are heard not directly by consciousness, just as images are not seen directly by consciousness, sounds are not seen. And the sounds are not heard directly. Indirectly, yes. Directly, no. Okay. Now this subject comes to an end with a final observation by Shankara. Apranaha hi amanaha yasmat, because we have this other statement, apranaha hi amanaha. We saw that 2 verses ago in the Mundaka Upanishad reference. I'm sorry, 1 verse before, prior verse. In the Mundaka Upanishad, that same language was used. But now Shankara is making a slightly different point here, and that is, all these scriptures are basically pointing to the same thing. If you're using a road map, and all the roads, all the different routes you can take lead you to the same destination, or here the other metaphor, all the scriptural pointers are pointing in the same direction, which is a good thing, you'll agree. If they were pointing in different directions, we would really be in trouble. But that's fortunately not the case. And that's what Shankara's point here is, that all of these Upanishads, all of these scriptural pointers, so to speak, they all point in the same direction, and therefore you can conclude, you can discover that the last word, aham, he indeed, aham, I am sada, always, avikari, unchanging. The unchanging consciousness that allows the changing conditions of your mind to be known. That concludes that prior topic and introduces the next topic, that word avikari. Okay. Avikari, to recognize that you are unchanging consciousness. That recognition is the result of self-inquiry. And how does it work? Remember that funny word I used before? It works through this process of de-superimposition. And that's what we're coming back to right now. How can you say, I am changeless consciousness? How does self-inquiry lead you to that discovery? Shankara makes it very clear in the next verse. Let's see that. Vikshepo nasti tasman me, vikshepo nasti tasman me, na samadhistato mama, na samadhistato mama, vikshepo va samadhirva, vikshepo va samadhirva, manasasyad vikarinaha, manasasyad vikarinaha. Tasmat, therefore, based on these scriptural revelations, therefore, nasti vikshepaha, may, for me, nasti vikshepaha, there is no vikshepa, vikshepa means disturbance. There is no disturbance, and also in the second line, na samadhihi, mama, for me. I have no disturbance, vikshepa. I have no samadhi, absorption. These words are used because they're opposites. So samadhi is the utter absence of mental activities. Vikshepa describes a jumble of mental activities. So these are at opposite ends of a continuum. And Shankara says, Tasmat, based on the scriptural revelations we've just discussed, that nasti vikshepaha me, for me, for consciousness, there is no vikshepa nor samadhi, and he makes it very clear in the second half. He says, vikshepaha va samadhi va, because both vikshepa and samadhi manasaha syat, belong to the mind. Vikarinaha. It's the mind that undergoes change and not consciousness. This is this is one of the central teachings of Advaita Vedanta. It's a crucial teaching, and it's sometimes hard to get in a very direct way. So let's experiment. Let's work on this a little bit. I've given the example you've heard me give too many times, so I'm not going to use it today. And the example is, in order, driving on a highway drinking coffee at 60 miles an hour, in order to see that driver drink coffee at 60 miles an hour, you have to be a stable observer. You have all heard that metaphor. Let me give you a different one today. And surprisingly, it's based on, and don't let me scare you, this example is based on Einstein's theory of relativity. But it's not that complicated. What Einstein says is whatever you observe depends on your frame of reference. This is one of the conclusions from his theory of relativity. Whatever you observe depends on your frame of reference. And that's basically my drinking coffee at 60 miles an hour example, right? If your frame of reference is moving at 60 miles an hour, and the guy drinking the coffee in the other car is also moving at 60 miles an hour, because your frame of reference is the same as the other guy's motion, you will witness you will observe, you'll experience no motion. This is Einstein. This is a very simple observation based on Einstein's theory of relativity. An example that I think he himself used. I don't think he used this coffee in the car example, but he frequently used another example. I believe he himself used. Anyway, other science teachers have used this one a lot, and it's this. If you were in an elevator, and that elevator was descending 9.8 meters per second, if that elevator were accelerating downwards, basically, if that elevator were in free fall, right? The cables are cut. So imagine being in an elevator just falling. What would that be like? So the elevator is your frame of reference. Not a stable frame of reference. It's a moving frame of reference, just like the fellow in the car at 60 miles an hour. So now your frame of reference is a free falling elevator. And what Einstein observed is that you experience no gravity in that falling elevator. That's interesting. Gravity is present, but you don't experience the gravity while you're in that particular frame of reference. If you want to experience gravity, you have to have a motionless frame of reference. Only if you have a motionless frame of reference can you experience gravity as it truly is on this planet. If you're in that moving frame of reference, you will not experience gravity as it is. This is another illustration to explain how, in order to observe the changing conditions of your mind, you must necessarily be an unchanging observer. So now we have one more metaphor we can use, the falling elevator. It's a matter of frame of reference. In order to observe the changing conditions of your mind, your frame of reference must be unchanging. Even Einstein, I don't think Einstein studied any of this, but perhaps he would agree. So Shankara's conclusion here is that the activities of your mind belong to your mind and not to unchanging consciousness. And he actually would just see that explained a little further in the next verse, and we'll stop with this verse. Amanaskasya shuddhasya, amanaskasya shuddhasya, katam tatsyadvayam mama, katam tatsyadvayam mama, amanastvavikaditve, amanastvavikaditve, videha vyapino mama, videha vyapino mama. Okay. I think it's better if we discuss this verse in our next class. Yeah, I think if I push ahead into it, we won't do this verse proper justice. We won't understand it properly. So we'll conclude a few minutes earlier today. We'll continue next week. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah, Sarve Santu Niramaya, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet, Asato Ma Satgamaya, Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya, Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.